We're jumping into week 3 of our Live Like Legends series. I'm going to start off with a question. Here we go. If you could do anything for God and you knew you would not fail, what would you do? If you could do anything for God and you knew you could not or would not fail, what would you do? Now, I'm going to come back to this question. We're going to leave it up here for a while. I'm going to come back to this, but at first, I got to share a story, okay? Because you know me, I like sharing stories. So here's a story I don't think I've ever told in a preach or a sermon. But Chris and I, we started dating in 2005, and we dated. We met at college. I was a sophomore. She was a freshman. We started dating. Our roommates introduced us to each other, and so she was from Washington State. And we went to college. We met in college in Jacksonville, Florida. I went to high school in Daytona Beach, went to college in Jacksonville. So we met there. She'd come across the U.S. to go to school for basically the equivalent of like a gap year at this Bible college that we were at or where we met. And so we started dating. And then after her freshman year, which was pretty much the plan, she knew she was going to be going back to Washington State to continue her education over there. And so we started dating long distance. Now this is, we started dating fall of 2005. This is now into the spring, summer of 2006. And back in those days, you had like minutes allotments on your cell phone plan. So like before 9 p.m., you would like eat up your minutes. Like now listen, this is important because for some of you younger people like today, you're like, minutes, who talks on the phone? Like back then, you didn't text because a text was 10 cents. And so if you started texting, it would just like blow up. So like she would send me a text. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you know, like you're gonna run me broke. And it's just like, you know, it's 3 texts. It's like 30 cents. But you're in college. You don't have much to work with to begin with. And now it's getting eaten up by text. Like wait till after 9 p.m. to call me. So she goes back to Washington State. And we decide we're gonna try this thing of long distance dating. And so that's what we're doing. We're dating long distance. But we decide like somewhere in the middle of the summer, like end of July or whatever, middle of July, like I would fly out to Washington State. And we would hang out and we would spend time over there, and then we would try to kind of make this plan where like every so often, every few months, we'd be able to like see each other or whatever, and try to make this long distance dating thing work. And so I flew out and I spent several days with her family, went to like Seattle Mariners game, hung out in the Pacific Northwest, never been out there before. It was beautiful, like the landscape, everything was just like unreal, just stunning. And so we had a great time. And then I pack up and I go back to Florida and, getting ready to start school. And like within like 2 weeks of like coming back, she calls me, going back to Florida, she calls me to tell me that she's breaking up with me. And she dumps me. And I'm like, we just hung out, like, and like legit, like she's like, we're done. And I'm like, no, you can't break up with me. Like that's actually what I said to her. I told her on the phone, like, you cannot break up with me. She's like, what do you mean? I'm doing it right now. I'm like, no, you can't. Like, I'm gonna marry you. And she's like, no, I'm breaking up with you. Like, we're not gonna get married. Like, you're breaking up with me. And so it was like, so I was so mad. Anyway, like I was just like, literally, I was like, well, fine. I dare you to go find someone better than me. And then hung up. And that was that. And it went several months and didn't hear from each other. Of course, we weren't texting because that's money, and I'm not texting someone who broke up with me. And so I'm not spending more money. And then, like, out of the blue, I get this phone call from her. And she calls me a couple months or maybe 3 months later or something and is like, hey, I'm sorry. I think I made a mistake. Maybe, I have, like, this break in my school and in my work, like, in November sometime. And I don't know, maybe like if you're open to it, we can try to like kind of work things out. Like, would you be willing to come back out to Washington and see if we can like make this work? And I'm like mad, I'm like, no, you don't just go calling me and then like trying to like reconnect and then say, hey, will you pay more money to come out here and do this? And so I was like, I don't know, I'll think about it. And so, like, I don't know how long I thought about it. Probably wasn't very long, I don't think. But I was like, yeah, I'm going to go do it. Like, I'm just going to, like, whatever. I'll figure it out, and I'll go do it. And so I'm telling my best friend, Chase, and he's like, man, I don't know, man. Like, bro, like, the last time you went, it didn't turn out so good. Like, what do you think's going to happen now? She's probably been talking trash about you to her parents for all this time, and then now you're going to go stay with them? Like, that's going to be weird. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right, but I was like, I guess I'll go anyway. And so, like, I get on this plane, I go over there, we get together, hang out, talk, spend, like, I don't know, it was like 3 days maybe. And, like, honestly, it was, like, great. It was like, wow, this is incredible. Maybe there is something here that like we should try to like work and save and try to do. And so we said, you know what, like we're gonna do this. We're gonna stick it out. We're gonna like make this relationship work. She was still over in Washington. I was going back to Florida. Like there was no plans to like try to move closer to each other. I was finishing my degree in Florida. She was pursuing her degree in Washington. And so we're just gonna date long distance. And then shortly thereafter, a few weeks later in December of 2006, she again calls me after 9 and says, hey, I'm coming back to Florida next month in a few weeks. And that way we can be close with each other and I'll just re-enroll in the school or whatever and just figure something out and work. But that way we can be like close to each other. Like I'm going to move back to Florida. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, are you sure about that? Like, that seems kind of risky. She's like, yeah, well, if we're going to make this work, like, I think we need to be together and be close. And, like, so I'm going to, like, pack up and move to Florida. And, like, and I'm like, have you talked to your parents about this? She's like, I talked to my mom, but I haven't told my dad yet. And I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of a problem. And because, now I can say this as a father of a girl, of a daughter. I'm like, yeah, my daughter came to me and was saying, hey, I'm going to move across the country for this boy that I dumped 6 months ago, and maybe we're going to try to work this out, and, like, I'm going to get married to him. And it's like, I'm like, no, you're not. I'm putting a, like, deadbolt on the outside of your door, and I'm going to put, like, those little baby guards up on the window, and then that way you can't get out, like, and make sure this can't happen. But she's like, this is what I'm going to do. And, like, we can work this out, and then we can talk through, like, we can be together, and then we can, like, plan, like, if we want to, like, we know we're supposed to get married, so, like, we'll kind of, like, work this out and figure this out. And so she was, like, literally about to alter her whole life to, like, take what felt like to, honestly, both of us, a bit of a gamble, and knowing that, like, just a few months ago, like, there was no us. And so in January, she packed up and she moved just a few weeks later, as she said, to Florida. And then a month later, on February 13th, 2007, I proposed to her. And then in August of 2007, we got married. Yeah. And we're still married. And so, like, yeah, thank you for the one person who clapped. I appreciate that. The rest of them are like, everyone else is a bit skeptical. Like, I'm not sure if this is going to make it. And so we'll hold on to our applause. But she took this gamble to, like, adjust and, like, take a risk on her life off of, like, a semi-promise, a certain uncertainty. And it just felt like so kind of crazy. But I wonder, has anyone else had a similar experience? Or maybe you've altered or adjusted your life on the hope of or on the basis of a promise that may or may not come to fruition, where you've maybe taken a step or a leap and you've moved towards something off the basis of someone else's word. And maybe even it felt like it was almost too good to be true, but at the same time, you couldn't afford to pass it up if it did become true. Does that make sense? Where it's like, I don't know if I can believe that, but if I miss, and it turns out like I don't want to be on this side of that thing. Maybe for some of you it was in your business or your career, and you're like, I've got to take a leap and jump into this venture or leave this organized thing or thing that I've been a part of and kind of step out on my own. Maybe it's been a financial promise, a family member or a relationship or a business partnership where it's like, okay, if I do this, it's going to present or provide something potentially lucrative or something that's going to be beneficial or position me ahead of or in where I am or where I could be on my own or apart with this. Maybe it was a relationship and you two have packed up like Krista did and moved across country or across states or wherever it might be in pursuit of a relationship in hopes that maybe something would turn out there. Maybe for you it was like a program or an education pursuit where you're like, I don't know that I'll get in, but like if I don't try, then it won't. Then I'll be miserable for the rest of my life. And if you've ever had that, like, can you just raise your hand, regardless of the outcome, regardless of the situation? Okay, look around the room really quick. All the hands raised. So the overwhelming majority of people, you can put your hands down, thank you. Regardless of the outcome, if you've experienced that, then the good news is you can relate to Abram in our story today. If you've had this moment where you've kind of like altered or shifted your life in hope of something or on the basis of a maybe or a promise, then you can relate to what he has to do. So here, let me kind of catch you up to speed on what's happening, okay? So Abram is the guy that we've been following over the past couple of weeks over the course of this Live Like Legends series. He lived, or when God reached out to him, he lived in Haran, which is in modern-day Turkey. God calls him to pack up and move his stuff and to make his way down to a land that God would ultimately reveal to him. But at the time, Abram didn't know really where he was going. He ends up settling in a place called Canaan, which is in modern-day Palestine. And so Abram arrives to modern-day Palestine. He's there for a period of time. We're told that there was a severe famine which drove his family south down toward the Sinai Peninsula and eventually over to the country of Egypt. And so Abram is there in Egypt for a period of time. And then he leaves Egypt. God says, hey, now it's time to leave Egypt and make your way back to Canaan. And so as he's arriving back or returning back to Canaan, he's there. It's his wife, Sarah, his nephew, Lot, and their whole households. But over the course of these years, Abram has, in almost every way, been increased. Meaning that his flocks, his livestock, his household, the families that traveled with him, the servants, the employees, if you will, of this Abram.co business was kind of like expanded. And so Lot also became wealthy, his nephew Lot, and it got to the point where they were kind of settled in the same region, but their needs were too big for their land. And so Abram says to his nephew, listen, why don't you choose where you want to go, and then I'll go the other way. We're family. There's no need for us to be competing over the same resources, over the same territory. So you choose where you want to go, and then I'll go the other way. And so that's what happened. Lot ends up moving a little bit further south toward the Dead Sea, and then Abram moves a little bit further north. And that's where we pick up in Genesis chapter 13, and starting in verse 14. It says, after Lot had gone, the Lord said to Abram, look as far as you can see in every direction, north and south, east and west. I am giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession. Now, let me pause right there. This promise, this idea of like, hey, if you do this, here's what could be yours. If you take this step, here's all that's available to you. Here's this relationship. Here's this financial resource. Here's this blessing. Here's this career advancement. Here's this education program. Here's this opportunity. That's what God is saying to him. I'm giving all this as far as you can see as a permanent possession, and I will give you so many descendants that like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted. Verse 17 says, go and walk through the land in every direction, for I am giving it to you. So Abram moved his camp to Hebron and settled near the oak grove belonging to Mamre, and then he built another altar to the Lord. Now here in this passage in Genesis 13, we find God reiterating a promise nearly identically to the way he communicated or conveyed it to Abram in Genesis chapter 12 when he first called Abram. He basically repeats and says the exact same thing to him. The difference being that in Genesis 13, between Genesis 13 and the first time God communicates it, or the first time it's recorded in Genesis chapter 12, is a span of probably 10 or 15 years, maybe even 20 years. We read it as back-to-back chapters, but it has certainly been more than a decade, and it has potentially been as much as 2 decades. This is the same promise repeated some 15 years, let's just call it 15 years after God first stated it. But get this, it still hadn't happened yet. It still hadn't come to fruition yet. Now remember, when Abram left Haran, when he left that place, we're told that he was 75 years old. So he was already old. As I said, he was not spry. He was an old head. And now he's even older. And God's telling him, hey, I'm going to give this land to you and your descendants. This promise that you're going to have, or you're going to become the father of a great and mighty nation. Yet Abram wasn't even capable of being a father of his child. He had no child of his own. And mind you, he was 75 when he left. Let's say he's 85, 90, maybe 95 years old at this point. Listen, unless you're like Robert De Niro, or unless you're like Al Pacino, like you're not having kids at that age. Throwing shade. It's just not happening. And on top of it all, he's still a foreigner in this land. This land is still the land of the Canaanites. It's not his land. His family has expanded, or his household has increased, his territory has increased, but it's still not his. So he can't, just walk in there, waltz in there and say, hey guys, this is mine. Hey guys, this is my nation. Hey guys, this is my property. And yet, despite all of these obvious reasons, despite all of these kind of realities, not just reasons, but realities standing in the way or opposed or against what God had promised Abram, it says that he still positioned himself and set up his camp in Hebron, which is in modern day Palestine. He set up hey, I'm going to believe God. I'm going to set myself up in the place that God said this promise is going to be fulfilled, even though I don't have children, even though I'm incredibly old, even though the promise hasn't come to fruition, even though I'm a foreigner in this land, he chose to still set himself up in the position for the miracle to take place. And what blows my mind is that is what faith looks like. The willingness to set yourself up, to stand in a place, to move into a territory, despite things not coming to fruition, despite the realization of those things seeming far off or inaccessible. And Abram did just that. And I think what Abram did is an example or a reminder to us that living with legendary faith is about choosing to position yourself with what you believe God is going to do, even when the conditions are less than ideal, even when the circumstances are less than favorable, even when the odds are not leaning your way, even when the chances of it coming to fruition seem less than positive. That legendary faith is one in which it says, I'm going to stand here, I'm going to position myself to see this come to fruition, even when nothing around me tells me it's going to come to fruition. And if you've ever lived with this type of faith, if you've ever taken that step, whether it was in that circumstance or that situation you were thinking about earlier, or maybe it's a present circumstance or situation you find yourself in now, if you've ever lived with that level of audacity and belief, then you recognize and you're fully aware that that's where things start to get dicey. That's where the waters start to get a bit turbulent. That's where the challenges seem to become more prevalent or more prominent. Because it's kind of like you've taken a step of faith, but you don't know if there's anything to put your foot on when it lands. And so you run the risk of kind of falling forward and falling on your face. And wondering, is God going to catch me? Is God going to be there? Not if I fall, but when. You're betting on a promise, something that maybe God told you, or a place that God led you to, or a relationship that God brought to you. And there's this level of uncertainty that surrounds you that causes you to feel like maybe I messed up. Maybe I made a mistake. Or maybe you've taken this step and you find yourself today in this place where it's been months or years or decades, as it was in Abram's case. And the realities or the realization of that promise seems no closer today than it did 15 years ago. And you're standing there wondering, did I hear him wrong? Did I make a mistake? Should I have just done what I thought I wanted to do all along? Because I don't see it happening. I'm surrounded in a place where I'm unfamiliar with the landscape. I have some things, but I don't have the thing. I have what I wanted in some respect, but I don't have the thing that I needed in another respect. And you find yourself stuck, waffling between, do I continue in faith or do I walk away from it? Do I continue chasing after the dream or the promise, or do I turn my back to it and say, nah, I tried that for far too long? And in that level, that place, you start to question, you start to worry, you start to wonder, you start to second guess, and maybe even you start to walk away. So we give up on the dreams that God has placed in our hearts. We give up on the promises that we once felt so certain about. We stop pursuing the calling that He's placed on us. Because It's been too long. Weeks, months, years, decades. And we think, well, what good has it brought me thus far? And we start playing it safe, don't we? We start planning our own agenda, playing by our own rules, making our own way. Because clearly the way that God led me on is not resulting or yielding the results that I anticipated. And listen, I've been there. I will gladly raise my hand because I've been far from perfect. And I've struggled in my own ways, and I've wrestled with things. And even in the course of writing this message, being reminded of promises and dreams that God has embedded in my heart and in my spirit, and some that I recently or more recently feel like I've given up on because I've not seen anything come to light. And I'm like, man, what's the point? Or what's the purpose? Where are we headed? And why? Because it doesn't seem to be in the direction that aligns with what you promised God. And the truth is that Abram was no different. It had been 10, 15 years, as I said, that Abram packed up, that he moved his family, he took his wife. I'm sure that in a moment of excitement and convincing to Sarah, he's like, listen, baby, God told me we're going to have kids. We're going to be we're going to be parents, and God's going to bring a nation out of us. And it's been 10, 15 years, and she's like, where's those kids you were talking about? Everyone else has got kids. Everyone else has families. We don't. We're providing an income for all these people to support their families, but we can't even have the thing that they have. And so Abram, after all these years, still nothing. And he questions and he wonders, and we know because of the conversation that he shared with God in Genesis 15. Look at this. Genesis 15, verse 1 says, sometime later the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you have given me no children, Eleazar of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. All these things that I have, God, they're just going to be passed off to a relative stranger. Because the thing that you've promised to me is nowhere to be found. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. Then the Lord said to Abram, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then verse 5, then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Now, let me just kind of offer this side note. Verse 7, I guess I'll read that too. Why not? It's there. Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. Now, I want you to know, and I felt like as I was prepping this message, that God wanted to speak something specific to someone, maybe several someone. Certainly, I feel like he's been speaking this to me. But God has so much compassion on you. And while this isn't the main point of today's message or the big idea in this preach, God wants to speak to you in a supportive and in a loving and in an encouraging way, in a restorative way, one that restores your ability to see, one that restores your ability to believe, one that restores your willingness to hope, one that restores your willingness or your desire to walk in faith. And he wants to speak this assurance into your life. He wants to restore something maybe that's been broken off or fallen off in the face of discouragement or in the face of disappointment or in the face of distraction. And he wants to kind of mend this thing back together and say, hey, let me piece this back for you. Let me support you. Let me strengthen you. Let me bring you something that makes you whole. And let me do so in a way that's tender, that's loving. You see, the delay does not mean that you've been denied. And the waiting does not mean you have to walk away. And the emptiness you feel does not mean you will continue to be empty-handed. That God wants to bring and give and release something in you. You see, God is for you. God is with you. His favor is for you. His blessing is for you. His promise is for you. His grace is for you. His strength is for you. His hope is for you. His character is for you. His heart is for you. And you may feel alone or isolated or discouraged or disappointed, but God wants you to know He is for you. He is with you. He is in this next to you. He has not abandoned you. He has not forgotten you. He has not forsaken you. And though there is a delay, and though there is waiting, and though there is struggle, and though there is questioning, God is speaking today, and He wants you to hear, hey, I am there in the waiting with you. I am standing beside you, my child. I am standing with you, my son. I will lift you up, my daughter. I have not forgotten you. I wrestled with whether I should say this. I put a question mark in my notes. I am. But God spoke this to me this week. And there are promises that I've hung on to for the better part of a decade. Explicit things that God has spoken and revealed. I could take you to the journal entry. I could take you to the house, to the place in the house, to the chair I was sitting in when God spoke and made a bold promise. And He didn't just make a promise. He explained why the promise was the promise. And I stand some 7, 8 years after those moments and still nothing. No hope, no closer. No provision, no answer. And for a long period of time, these last few years, no clarification. And as I sat on my computer and was typing away on my keyboard in this over-dramatized way, it was like the Holy Spirit was just whispering, Ricky, I'm for you. My favor is still for you. My blessing is still for you. My purpose is still for you. And Ricky, my promise is still for you. And I don't understand what God is doing. But what I'm trying to understand is what I'm going to deliver to you today. And so I want you to know that as I preach this, I'm not preaching from the vantage point of having obtained this. I'm not preaching from a place of I'm the expert, follow me. I'm preaching from the point of saying, hey, I'm willing to pioneer. I'm willing to run forward. And will you run with me? And I feel like whatever amount of courage or guidance was needed for this, that God is trying to somehow manifest it in me so that I can walk forward, so that I can take the next step on this path of living with legendary faith. And what I'm grateful for is that in those moments when I doubt, when I question, when I struggle, when I give up, rather than meeting me with judgment or rebuke, God meets me with comfort and compassion in the same way that He met Abram. See, because Abram too struggled. Look back at Genesis 15:1. Look at how God met him. It says, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, notice this, do not be afraid, Abram. Do not be afraid, Abram. See, the first area that God spoke into his life was this area of fear. And I think fear is something we all can relate to, isn't it? Fear is something that we all have. Doesn't matter how tough you are, how tough you think you are. We all have fears that come into our lives. Fear of being known. Fear of someone saying, oh, that's the real you, then I want nothing to do with you. Fear of failure. Fear of messing things up. Fear of abandonment. Fear of loss. Fear of being unsafe. Fear of being out of position. fear of missing out, fear of being alone. Am I going to be single for the rest of my life? I've passed my prime, and this what you have for me, God? And now all of a sudden, no one won't even look at me because I'm at this age, or I'm at this place, or I've had X amount of failed relationships, or I've been divorced. Could anyone ever love me again? Or I've been an abuser, and so will people ever think that he will restore, that she will become back on her feet and be a good person, or a righteous person, or a stand-up person? And so there's this fear that overwhelms us. Fear of sacrifice. What if I give it all up and it doesn't work out? What if I offer it to you, God? What if I give up this thing you've asked me to give up and it just doesn't come to fruition, or it just doesn't turn out? And we wrestle with those things, but God's words were so calming, we're so understanding, where he just speaks and says, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you. Abram, you don't need to fear, because I will be with you. Abram, you don't need to fear because I will protect you. Insert your name. So-and-so, you don't need to fear because I will protect you. And I wonder if we've given up on these dreams, if we've given up on God's purposes, if we've stopped living with faith because we've been overwhelmed by our fears. So let me ask you, what fears are before you? See, Abram dwelled in a land where he did not belong. At least not from his vantage point. And it was overwhelming to think that somehow this man in a distant place, in a foreign region, someone who hasn't even been able to settle for the past 2 decades of his life, is now all of a sudden supposed to cultivate or produce a mighty nation. And yet he can't even have a child of his own. And I wonder if there's some fears in your life that are keeping you, some fears before you that stand in front of you. Financial fear, relational fear, personal fear, that are standing in your way and keeping you from living with the faith that God is calling you to live with. And listen, just like Abram, I would invite you to recognize that God is standing with you and saying, I will protect you. But Abram wasn't just afraid. He also had his doubts. Look at this in Genesis 15, verses 2 and 4. Abram replies, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eleazar of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. Then the Lord said to him, No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own, and he will be your heir. See, Abram questioned. He doubted, right? As I said, how could I become the father of a nation when I can't even become the father of one? How will I have a multitude of generations of descendants when me and my wife can't even have one? And God, reminder, I'm old. My wife, she's old. I love her to death, but she's old. And God starts speaking into these doubts. And I realized this as I was kind of thinking through the difference between fear and doubt. What it seems to me is that fear is often like this external thing, this thing that's out there. That's why I put it that way. What fear is before you? Whereas doubt is this thing that's within us, isn't it? Like fear is something externally, and then doubts tend to be kind of the narratives that are within ourselves. The things that we say, the way we speak to ourselves. And doubt, right, expresses itself in a multitude of variety of ways. There's comparison, right? Well, I'm not as strong as that person. I don't have as much faith as that person. I'm not as religious or as spiritual as that person. I don't know as much scripture as that person. There's insecurity, like, right, what if I mess up? My family, my parents, my siblings, they've always told me you're a mess up, that you never get anything right. And so what if I take this step of faith, God, that you've asked me to take, and I screw it up or I botch it, just like I've done my whole life? And so I don't know that I can do that, God. Or there's this insufficiency, like, do I have what it takes? Can I do this? Is that really possible for me to do that? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know that I could do that, God. I don't know that I could live with that level. And it's so funny how doubt has a way of convincing us about everything other than the truth. Man, it'll crowd out everything. Make you believe anything other than the truth. Charles Spurgeon put it this way: doubt discovers difficulties which it never solves. It creates hesitancy, despondency, despair. Its progress is the decay of comfort, the death of peace. As doubt progresses, it decays comfort. It brings the death of peace. Listen, doubt just kind of disrupts all of these things. And so then I ask you, what doubts are within you? Because it's not just the fears that are before you, but it's the doubts that are within you. What's the story you're telling yourself about yourself? What's the narrative playing through your mind, through your heart, through your spirit that's causing you to second guess, to question whether God actually loves you, to wonder whether God could really use you, to step into what God has spoken to you? What is the doubt, or where is that doubt lingering within you? So it's what's before you, it's what's within you, but it's not just those things. It's also what's been placed above you. And we'll get to this question in just a second. But what I've realized is that for many Christians, they have placed a cap on what they believe God is capable of doing. Or should I say, they have placed a cap on what they believe God is capable of doing for them. Can God do it for someone else? Absolutely, 100%. I believe in it. God is good. God is big. God is great. Can he do it for me? I don't know. I don't think so. Will he do it for you? Probably not. And we've placed a ceiling, whether it's due to fear or doubt or something altogether differently. We've placed a ceiling on our expectations. And maybe for some, the reason for that is where you think, well, if I don't get too high in my expectations, then I can't get too low in my disappointment. And so it's a safety mechanism. But it keeps you and it prevents you from seeing and doing what God has called you to do. And this, I think, is evident in our inability to dream or to run the race with great faith. To believe for the impossible, to see what's not seen, to step into what's unknown. And instead, what we do is shrink back. Instead, what we do is recoil. Instead, what we do is say, yeah, that's for them, but not for me. And we place a cap and a ceiling. And again, look at this in Genesis 15:4. Check this out. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up in the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. Now, Paul, you say, well, what does that have to do with anything? God, this was a physical and a literal. It was as much physical and literal as it was spiritual and metaphorical. God had to take Abram outside of his tent. You see, the tent represents the ceiling that was over his vision, his belief, his faith. And God had to move him out of the tent and say, look up to the stars, look up to the sky, and see what you can't see because you placed a ceiling over my potential, because you placed a ceiling over my possibility, because you placed a ceiling over my personhood. And God is saying, hey, step out of your tent. And maybe today, this is what God is calling on you to do, is to walk out of that tent, to step out from underneath that covering and to see what you cannot see, to believe for what's unseen, to step into the more that he has for you if you were just willing to remove the ceiling or the cap that's been placed above you. So I ask, what ceiling dwells above you? What is the limitation? What is the barrier? What is the border that you've set between you and God that's limited your expectation, that's muted your ability to step in faith, that's neutered your willingness to take a risk because you're not sure that God will come through? What is it that's blocking you from living with legendary faith? Because God is saying, step out of that tent. Come outside, look at the sky. Believe in something more than what you can see in your current positioning. See, I believe God wants to draw your eyes upward, away from and outside of your present realities or circumstances. And he wants to invite you to look up, to look to him. And he's saying to you exactly what he said to Abram in verse 7. And he said, my bad, I'll read it to you. Here it is. He says, then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. Translation, I'm the one that set you up. I'm the one that took you out. I'm the one that led you this far. I'm the one that's moving you forward. It's me, Abram, not you. So don't look at your limitations. Don't look at your restrictions. Don't look at what you don't have. Recognize that I'm the one that's done everything up to this point, and I will continue to move forward. I will continue to press you on. I am the promise keeper. I am the star breather. I am the dream believer. I am the one who moves us into the unknown, who steps or who guides us into what's possible, not what is. That God is saying, hey, this is what I want for you. And in the same way, if you look back over your life, I don't know what events or circumstances or relationships or networks or opportunities or failures or shortcomings or disappointments or discouragement has led you to this very moment at this present time in this room. But I do know God did it on purpose. And he's redeeming it on purpose. So that you could answer this question. If you could do anything for God and you knew you would not fail, what would you do? When I think of the legends of faith, I'm blown away by their willingness to believe for the impossible. To live as if failure was not an option. To take risks, to gamble, to alter their lives in response to a calling or a purpose or a loose plan. To say yes to God, to go with God, to step out of their tents and to dream for the impossible. Meta Church, I truly believe that God wants us to dream and believe for the impossible with him. And even over the course of this last week, I've had some conversations with people, and I was talking about different things, different steps of faith that people are taking. And I was talking with one person in particular, and I was like, well, how are you doing? And they were like, well, I'm doing good. And I said, well, how are you really? Because I understood this step this person was going to take and the weight and the significance of this step. And this person said, well, I'm kind of scared. I said, yeah, I'm kind of scared for you too. And we chatted for a little bit, but then I said to this person, I said, but I know, based off of what you shared, this is the step that God is calling you to take. And that kind of faith is the faith that I want. That kind of church is the church that I would love to lead. So Meta Church, let's live with legendary faith.